Exit Photography Group. The exhibition is at the left-hand side of the library, if you haven't seen it yet, which will stay open until 8:30 this evening, so there will be a chance to see it after the event. And it was curated by Chelsea Collison, Indy Buller from LSE Library, as well as Dr. Cadence Kinsey, one of our panelists this evening. Just to explain the way it's going to work, I'm really here just to field your questions at the end, but we are going to start with a conversation with the panelists, but there will be plenty of time for you all to ask questions at the end. The exits are to your right and your left if for any reason we need to rush out of the building. So let me introduce the panelists, starting at the end. We have Professor Cadence Kinsey, Professor of Contemporary Art and Global Social Challenges at Utrecht University. Prior to this position, Cadence held positions at University College London and the University of York. Her first book, Walled Gardens, Autonomy, Automation, and Art After the Internet, is a study of a young generation of artists characterized by their engagement with new internet technologies that have come to reorganize life and labor. We then have next to her, Carla Mitchell. Carla is the artistic director of Four Corners London, where she curates its public gallery and archive programs. Recent exhibitions and associated publications include Conditions of Living, Home and Homelessness in London's East End, and Photographing Protests, Resistance Through a Feminist Lens. She was the recipient of a curatorial research grant from the Paul Mellon Centre for a Radical Vision, Community Film and Photography in the 1970s and 80s London, which then supported the creation of the Four Corners online archive. We then have Paul Trevor. Paul has been taking photographs since he was 25, and his photography is motivated by keen social impulse. He was a founder member of the Exit Photography Group and the Half Moon Photography Workshop, which we'll be speaking about at length today, where he also co-edited Camera Work magazine for 6 years. He has exhibited widely and steadily since the 1970s, and his work is in the collections of the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Museum of London, and the British Council, amongst others. And lastly, we have Ellen Stone, who is the creative director of Side Gallery Newcastle upon Tyne, and a curator known for her innovative approach to archives through recontextualizing the social importance of pop culture and art photography. In 2009, Ellen founded Public Offerings Limited, a photographic curatorial consultancy that champions diversity and inclusion by highlighting those underrepresented in the traditional gallery and museum system. So we were really just going to run this as a sort of discussion amongst the panelists, thinking very much about Exit Photography Group and a number of other collaborative projects that were created in the 1970s, thinking about how they live through the wonderful archive we here have at LSE, and also that importance of that era for British photography and really what it means to exhibit and show such work in 2024, where we can see the resonances very clearly. So I'm just going to begin by asking Cadence if she could speak a little bit about how the project sort of came to fruition and came about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Laili. Can I just ask, have people had a chance to see the exhibition already? Okay, some yeses, but also some no's. Okay, so I'll sort of try and say a little bit about it as I talk about how the exhibition came about. So the core focus is the photo book survival programs by Exit Photography. There are many different ways to describe this project, and I will ask Paul in a moment to put in his own words how he might introduce it, but broadly, it was a project to photograph the kind of social and economic crises of inner cities across the UK in the 1970s. The LSE holds the materials related to the making of the project, so the kind of contracts, negotiations, proofs, notes, and so on, whereas Amberside, if I'm not mistaken, actually hold the photographs themselves. So in a way, this is really an exhibition about kind of the making of this photo book. The exhibition itself was the idea of Indy Buller at the front here, who is the curator for economics and social policy at the London School of Economics Library, who I worked together with Indy and Chelsea on the exhibition. So how the exhibition came about, a researcher called Noni Stacey had used the archival materials to inform a recent book that she had published on radical community projects of the 1970s. Having worked with some of the LSE library materials, Indy had done an interview with her. And so this was really the start of kind of making visible the materials that were actually in the archive. So although the photo book was well known, it was more about kind of bringing to life what the LSE actually had. And, you know, speaking with Noni Stacey and doing more work into the archival materials, we kind of realized what rich holdings there were, but also what an interesting story there was to tell about the making of the book, from kind of who funds it to who publishes it. And I don't have time to really go into all of this, but this is in part the job of the exhibition, or the story that we try and tell in the exhibition. So while Indy was working on developing this exhibition project around the photo book, I had already been in the LSE archive, also looking at some materials related to social class and inequality, but I'm an art historian, so I'm particularly interested in images. So I've been kind of doing some searching for images that the LSE might hold, very, very broadly, kind of anything to do with social class and inequality. And what I found was that there had been a real sort of explosion of visual material that was being produced from the 1960s and 70s, particularly in relation to photojournalistic representations of poverty. And of course, poverty is not the same as social class, and inequality is really important. That often when we're trying to find out about some of these topics, we only hear echoes of them in the archive. It can be very hard to actually research them directly. And then in the early 80s, kind of, again, the sort of explosion of visual materials, but particularly coming from campaigning groups. So the anti-poverty campaigning groups, Child Poverty Action Group, Action for Benefits, they're really starting to kind of use images in a significant and substantial way. And what was interesting for myself and Indy was how this timeline really kind of straddled the work that Exit were doing. So the photo book, the photos are being taken in the mid to late 1970s, so kind of in the run-up to Thatcher, but then the photo book itself is published in 1982. So Thatcher's elected 79, the photo book published by Open University Press in 1982. So it's a really kind of complicated and interesting timeline. So we thought we would kind of put these different kinds of materials that the LSE archive holds together, partly to contextualize the work that the LSE was doing, but also to really try and tell a bit of a bigger story about the way in which different types of images, so media representations, documentary photography, campaigns, photojournalism, and so on, were documenting and responding to socio-economic crises in the inner cities during this time. And for those of you who haven't seen the exhibition, just to kind of draw out one particular connection that was of interest to myself, was the decision by Exit Photography to not necessarily reproduce images of kind of misery, despair, deprivation, but really to try and represent the individuals in the photographs as subjects worthy of dignity and respect, as subjects rather than as objects, as subject to discrimination, victimization, pity, and so on. And what was interesting for me is that this is precisely the same kind of visual strategy that many campaign groups were also using. So this is a very particular tactic that Child Poverty Action Group, founded in 1965, were also dedicated to, that they didn't want to show certain types of stereotypical representations. They wanted to try and show something different. So it was interesting for me to kind of think about, you know, how we choose to represent these issues, and why. And the last thing I wanted to say really about the kind of, for me, at least the sort of underpinning ideas around the exhibition is that this is, or I see it as very much not an exhibition about the past, but an exhibition about the present. And this is not just because of the legacies of deindustrialization or the policies of Thatcher's government, which we continue to feel today. And of course, this year it's 40 years of the miners' strike, and next year, 2025, will be the 60-year anniversary of the founding of the Child Poverty Action Group. But specifically really more about recent conditions of austerity, the cost of living crisis, and the fact that so many people in one of the richest countries in the world continue to live in struggle and with unacceptable hardship. So for me, the work that Exit were doing in the 1970s, as well as the work of Four Corners and Amberside, and I want us to kind of really think about some of these different groups together, really continues to resonate today and is connected to the work of many contemporary artists. So it's very exciting for me that we have you all here together. And to kind of think a little bit about some of these histories and the legacies of exit photography. So I wondered if I could maybe then just start with Paul, a couple of questions for yourself. And perhaps if you might introduce survival programs in your own words, how would you describe it?
Well, here's the book. And it's interesting what you said. We finished the work in 1979, 1980. So Thatcher had just, so this is all the work was done in the years before, so really during the time of the Labour government. And it took 2 years to find a publisher. So, and in fact, we were very fortunate. The Open University published it. What actually happened was we presented it. We had a very clear idea of what we wanted to do, that we had all these interviews and we put all the interviews, it could have been a book just of the interviews. We felt very powerful. We didn't even, at the beginning, intend to do any interviews. It was going to be a 6-month photographic project. We were all beginners. This was my first photographic job. So to say that, we had a clear idea of what, we had no idea, and we certainly had no idea it was going to take 6 years to complete it. It was a nightmare, in fact. Having finally finished it by 1980, the idea that we couldn't find anyone to publish it was really daunting. What's the word? It was really galling. It was absolutely galling. Now Penguin saw the work and said, we like all the stuff, but people have an expectation of what a book should be. Mix the pictures up, jazz it up a bit, put some interesting captions and so on. And that was entirely contrary to our concept of what it should be. It could be the series of interviews that we did. As I said, we weren't intending to do any interviews, but Nick, and again, another feature of our group is we always disagreed about everything. So in the 70s, the cameras were heavy, you're carrying loads of film, you're carrying all sorts of stuff. And now, thanks to Nick, we were going to have to carry these really heavy recording machines and tapes and cassettes and, and so I said, absolutely no way. Nick, of course, proceeded to do some interviews, came back to our regular meetings, and we sat down, read his first 2 interviews, and we thought, oh, we're now lumbered. They were so powerful, they were so good. They were dealing with a level and dimension that the photographs couldn't hope to capture. And we realized we had to incorporate them. So yes, to describe it, it's a book with 100,000 words edited down from 1 million words. And we spent more time with the editing of the words than we did with the pictures. So that's one thing I'd say. And also, you don't have to look at any of the pictures, just to read the text. It could have been, like I say, a book of just interviews. On the other hand, it could also have been just a book of photographs. We sequence it into 4 chapters. And we say right at the beginning, this book can be seen as a picture story, and you can just go through it, and it has its own narrative, and it makes sense. By putting the two together, we realized we were creating something quite interesting. The text would be from one part of the country, the picture would be from somewhere else. The text would sometimes throw light or contradict or draw kind of nuances about what you're seeing. So you're reading all this stuff, which takes time. The image is instant. And as you're reading, all kinds of other things come to mind. So it's very open. It's very, what I'd say, very democratic. And we didn't plan it. We had no idea when we were setting out the layout of the book, what text would come up against what picture. We had no idea. We didn't care. It didn't really matter. And when Penguin said, jazz it up and mix it all up, we just thought, well, they didn't get it. They didn't get actually the thing that was so special about what we were attempting to do. And so we struggled finding, for 2 years, having spent all that miserable time doing the work, trying to find a publisher, to Routledge and others. And in the end, we sent it to the Open University because they publish 600 books a year. And we thought, surely. But in fact, those 600 books are for the courses that they were running. And it was such a thankless task, 600 books, that they gave the guy, his name was Skelton, John Skelton. He was the guy who was, if you like, the production manager of all this. Lovely guy. He knew nothing about photography. He received this package from us. He took it home for the weekend. And luckily for us, his sister was there. She knew about photographs. She was a very keen, very keen about photography. And she told him, listen, you've got to publish this book. And because he knew nothing about photography, he gave us complete control, which was unheard of. And that was the great blessing for the fact that it's an Open University. It was a blessing. The curse was Thatcher came to power, and the Open University was seen as a quango. And they were going to purge all the quangos. All the quangos were these, well, the Open University was a quango, something created by the Labour government and not in the private sector. And they were going to get rid of them. And so the Open University was so nervous, thinking that this was a political book, that they didn't promote it. And the actual, on release, the promotion consisted of John Skelton taking myself and Chris out for a meal. And that was it. Some years later, we realized the book wasn't really, it got some reviews, but really wasn't reaching any kind of audience. We asked them to do a poster, which is in the exhibition. It's got an image of a terrorist, and it said, I can't remember the wording, but it's something like, we have been warned or something, just something to promote it. I really didn't do much good. So how would I describe it? I think it's, for us, it was just, we just wanted to get the book out of our lives. We were in our 20s. 6 years seems like forever. And we were just really just relieved. That was the feeling I got when it was just done. It was over and done with. And we could get on with our lives. And we all went off in, different directions. Naturally, we're pleased we did it. We did our best. And I think that's really all you can say. It was a very thorough piece of work because we had the energy of 3 people. I don't think a one person could have done it. So it had that, the fact that we were 3, and by coincidence, we'd had this idea of we were a group of sorts. So yes, it had those elements that made it possible to produce this work.
And on that question of energy, could I ask you what your motivation was originally to do this project. Why was this subject matter important for yourself and others in the group? Because I guess this could come from your lived experience, people wanting to document their own communities. It could come from debates that were happening elsewhere in documentary photography. Like, what was important for you?
Right. I mean, we were all living. So Chris was living in Brixton. I was living just off Brick Lane in the East End. Nick was living in a Peabody building in King's Cross. So we were all in the city. We completely knew the subject. We were there. We were photographing our neighbors and our communities. So, but that wasn't it really. We were beginners, and we were, well, Nick, I, Diane, and Alex, because Chris joined later. So our first project was a group project, and we really, our ambition, our motivation was to see if we could actually work as a group, because photographers traditionally don't. You know, it's very individualistic. I actually didn't even want to be a photographer. I wanted to be a filmmaker. And I'd been working with amateur groups. So when I met these people on a beginner's course, I said, do you fancy working in a group? And so they came round to my place on that weekend with their friends. Nothing much was said. And as people were leaving, somebody said, well, you know, what are we going to photograph? At that point, the question was, could we actually be a group? So Nick said, well, look, there's loads of exit signs all over the place in London. Just photograph that. And that was it. That was our motivation, if you like. We're going to photograph exit signs. And the name stuck because that following week, someone told me about Wapping, and it was by the river, and it was in decline. It was very atmospheric. The docks are shut, massive wharfs, lots of shadows, dark areas. And we went down there for a few weekends, and it really was like being part of a crew, and the energy that we created together, and the consequences, you know, because when you're on your own, there's only so much interaction that you can have. When you're a group, it's a multiple of that. So that was amazing. And to our amazement as well, as beginners, we had a little booklet that local people raised the money, because we were giving away our reject prints and it wasn't enough. So they raised the money to do this little booklet. And that little booklet led to Peter Brinson, who was the guy at the Gulbenkian, thinking we were an established group and we should do this project. And so it all happened completely, you know, ad hoc and by chance. And there's no way we were ready. We were all hoping to go to college and learn how, you know, do a photo course. In my case, I wanted to do a course that also did filmmaking. And then we decided, okay, it's 6 months, it'll be a good experience, and we'll do the course next year. Yeah.
It's very interesting to hear you talk about that, because to me, looking at the materials in the archive, it looks so planned. Because what we see, what Indy and I see as we were going through the materials, is we see lists, we see charts, we see graphs, we see, you know, so it looks like you're thinking absolutely meticulously about the kinds of decisions that you're making. And so I guess one of the questions sort of following on from that was, I wondered if there were things then, once the project had started, were there subjects that you particularly wanted to show, or perhaps more interestingly, not to show?
Yeah, very simply, the traditional, what Gulbenkian were expecting was one of these exhibitions, a touring exhibition that would be educational and show poverty, you know, horrible working conditions, housing conditions, just that. And that would alert people that something has to be done. That was basically it. They were funding, they were a foundation that's a philanthropic organization. They were funding these kinds of groups around the country. And they thought, yeah, we would just be really illustrating that. And yes, literally 50 years ago to this day, we came back from our first recce. And our recce consisted of the Gulbenkian giving us a list of all the groups up and down the country that they were, funding in some way, sponsoring. Some in Wales, some in Liverpool, some in Merseyside, Glasgow, Midlands. And we drove for 4 weeks visiting these places. And when you look at the book, very, very few of those contacts resulted in anything substantial. Actually, all the photography was down to us to make contact, hang around a street corner, start talking to somebody. That was it. It wasn't a list, proved to be not very helpful.
Maybe this is a good point to bring in Ellen and Carla. I have some questions for you about this kind of bigger moment, but perhaps I could just ask you to begin by saying a few words about your respective organisations. Ellen, maybe if we start there.
So we're called Side, and we are a cultural hub. So we have multiple different parts. There is Side Gallery, which actually showed the exact thing we're talking about in 82 and was part of the touring of it. We have a cinema, which was started as a debate cinema, which is about documentary and independent film. And we're the home of the Amberside Trust Archive, which has all of the images from the Amber Film and Photography Collective, along with things that they collected over time to build an archive, not just of the UK and industrial, which is what a lot of people think exists there, but a kind of very wide-reaching social look at things that have been happening all over the world. And their real love for survival programs comes down to this idea that at the core of the collective is this idea of kind of humanist principles in photography, this empathy and this kind of relationship, that exactly what we're talking about, turning away from those kind of almost Victorian images of what poverty should be, and instead the dignity and respect that photographers can show to their subjects. So I suppose that's why I'm here to talk about it.
And Carla, would you say a few words about Four Corners?
Yeah, sure. So Four Corners, we're a centre for film and photography. We're based in East London. We've been around more or less 50 years this year, although it's a bit that the origins are a bit lost in the midst of time, but we're actually an amalgam of two organisations. So one is Four Corners, which was a film organisation based on Roman Road in Bethnal Green since 75, for filmmakers who met at college. But we are also the inheritor of our sister organisation, if you like, which was Camera Work, which of whom Paul is one of the very early founder members, originally known as, this is where it gets complicated, originally known as the Half Moon Gallery, based in Ailey Street in the foyer of a squatted theatre, which was showing Bertolt Brecht plays in the early 1970s, and quite probably, I think, the second photography gallery, second or third in the country, which then became Half Moon Photography Workshop, with the inclusion of Joe Spence and Terry Dennett, who had a different organisation called Photography Workshop. This is getting far too complicated. But in any case, there were a group of people of whom Paul can talk far more eloquently than I can, who were burgeoning, emerging photographers, but also people very concerned around issues of representation, engagement, the way in which photographers engaged with their subjects. And they began to produce this very well-known, some of you may know of it, photography magazine called Camera Work, which ran from the mid-70s to the mid-80s and was really one of the most important forums for the discussion around the politics of representation and the representation of politics, I guess. It was sort of both. And cutting a long story short, the organisation eventually became known as Camera Work, And then having bought its building in Roman Road, very sadly lost its Arts Council funding. And so whiz forward to 2000, Four Corners, two doors down, was struggling because we were about to be evicted. Meanwhile, Camera Work had lost its Arts Council funding and really had almost had to close. And Four Corners, basically, after a long process that this is getting too complicated, managed to inherit the remit of Camera Work in terms of its building, its darkrooms, its gallery, and therefore we have really over the last 20 years transformed ourselves into a centre for film and photography. So what do? We have a gallery programme. We run training and community participatory projects, particularly with local people, not exclusively. We also support a range of filmmakers and photographers at every level, from emergent to professional, in our building. So I think that's probably enough in terms of an overview of Four Corners. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, could I ask the three of you, and anyone who wants to start is very welcome, maybe just to say a bit more about this moment of British photography, because it is so striking that this is the moment of, so the late 1960s, I think it's 68 for Amber, 70, please forgive me.
Two,
have it
roughly.
written. Yeah,
It's
Half Moon,
Yeah.
also 72, Camera Work. So that there's something happening in this particular moment. And I just wondered if the three of you might say something about that, you know, why this moment, and what are the kind of particular problems for photographers in the UK, perhaps even thinking about dialogues with America or not, and what's going on in documentary photography in America, or, you know, but what are the kind of particular concerns for British documentary at this time?
Well, I mean, I said it took 2 years to find a publisher. Today, there are, just so many photography books, print on demand, you can print your own. The digital technologies, that has been a massive revolution in the whole photography culture. So there's been an amazing boom almost of photography books. I mentioned earlier, I've seen 3 books in the last 2 weeks that all about this period that we were photographing, work that wasn't well known or hasn't been published, and now in handsome publications, and there's still an interest in them, even though it's kind of going back to the 70s, 80s. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, I mean, it's really it's so difficult, because when we were doing this, when this exhibition, the exhibition about that era was so different, you needed a dark room, you needed chemicals, you needed films, expensive. There was none of this spontaneous things. There was no social media. There was no internet. There was, I mean, there was no smartphone. I mean, it was so different, right? And so I'm one of that generation that has crossed over from the analog era of photography to the digital. And I would say, this is a big claim I'd make tonight, is that I'm one of that first generation of photographers who believed that we had the right to be respected for our work, to be authors of our work, to control our work. The generation prior to us, I'm talking about people like Don McCullin, he had no control over his how he's photographed. In fact, he's so filled with angst. He used to run around with some of his Biafra pictures. He was so outraged that he would go and, paste them up in underground stations and so on. He was of that generation where, yes, he got a credit. The previous generation didn't even get a credit. The writers got a credit, photographers never got a credit. So the first of that generation, the 50s generation, was Bert Hardy, was the first picture post photographer. He got a credit for his work, acknowledged the name of a photographer. Then you have, but all of them were always under the whatever, the regime of the picture desk and the owners of the magazines and the newspapers. Generally very rich people who controlled what went out. It's still the same today. But photographers from my generation were the first, in the 70s, camera work, what it was a group of photographers demonstrating, hey, we can do some interviews, we can do layout, we can produce a magazine, we can talk to printers. We had complete control, and the buzz was that our readers were other photographers thinking, wow, this is amazing. Never seen photographers, being able to do all this, because they were all idiots. Just take the picture and give it in, and that was it. So I would say you can see from that period, that late 70s, 80s, so the Martin Parr generation, the 80s, all doing their books, authorial, printing, self-publishing, Paul Graham self-publishing his color stuff. That was a turning point. And now we've reached a point where more or less all the, I went to see the MA photography course at London Metropolitan. Every single student, besides fantastic work, technically fantastic, all had a book or two or three. It's almost like a given now. So that's a huge, huge change in the culture of photography. The other change, obviously, is the online social media thing, which is, we can talk about maybe another time.
Yeah, Ellen or Carla, would you like to say something about that 1970s moment?
Yeah.
Yeah, from a kind of Amber and their collective approach, actually what's really interesting, particularly about the time period, is that they are going and they are studying. And it's whilst they're students that they form the collective. And actually, in part, there is this resentment almost at the fact that education in any way disenfranchises them from roots. This kind of cultural ownership question, the idea of coming from other places, but becoming part of what is now the educated class, whether that separates you from who you are. And that's also part of why this kind of communal thing happens. This idea of being a collective, everything is level, everyone is together, they are earning the same amount of money, they are doing all of these things as a group, because there is a right to own who you are, which in a time when you are actually, for the first time, for the first generations, being encouraged to change that, it's actually quite a shock to you and to who you are and your heritage. And like that's built into that time period, but also the kind of the starting of Amber and the reason Side exists and why it exists in Newcastle.
Thank you. It's really interesting. So Paul, in a way, I guess you're talking about a kind of a dialogue with media, with publishing, with newspapers, and Ellen, you're describing a kind of something about education and what this does to thinking about the status, even the class status of the artist. Carla.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just more sort of broadly into just looking at it culturally, obviously, these groups come out of 68, they come out of a new generation, which is the first post-war generation that is really able to kind of change their sort of political and cultural perspectives, I think in a way that hadn't really happened before. So, the whole idea of actually working in a collective is something new. It's something quite revolutionary, in fact. The idea of collective decisions, however difficult, which they certainly were. A lot of the politics, I think, around in the 1970s were very much as well informed by the growth of feminism, which again was challenging kind of traditional ways in which things had been done. I mean, despite the fact that actually, women, I don't know about Side, but certainly in camera work struggled, within those collectives. But certainly the ideas around people actually living and behaving differently from their parents was a big part of it. So certainly it wasn't just working in the collective, but it might also be the way in which you lived. That there were wonderful amounts of short life housing in London, or you could squat very easily. So you could, there was this alternative lifestyle, which is very hard to imagine now, whereby young people could maybe sign on the dole and, have very low cost rent and sort of be a photographer. And it certainly wasn't very well paid, but, there was a space in which that was possible. And that, that generation, and I think also a kind of a sort of left political ethos that developed after 1968 really sought to transform. I mean, I think that the arts was very much part of a kind of community activism, which was trying to transform the way things were in many different ways. So what Paul describes in terms of photography was also happening in publishing, or in charitable organizations, that there were sort of grassroots initiatives of a variety of kinds. And obviously within London, I don't know about Newcastle, but certainly within London, that was very much supported through the Greater London Council, which certainly under Ken Livingstone was very radical. So there was this space in the 70s which was quite fluid, and it seems to be that there were many different elements that were allowed to be. I think maybe by the 80s that was becoming more sort of solidified, and maybe the politics, these sort of anti-Thatcher politics, meant that in a way everything became a bit more oppositional, which partly maybe kind of nailed things down to some extent. The 70s seemed to have been quite fluid in terms of their kind of radical thinking as well, if that addresses things.
Absolutely. And maybe then if I could pick up on, Paul, what you said earlier about this kind of renewed attention to that moment in photography, that you've seen these books being published recently of these photographers who at the time might have been not so well known, that my impression is that, there's been a kind of something of a rekindling within kind of amongst non-specialist photography audiences and international audiences of British photography from this moment. So there was the big exhibition at Washington, the This Is Britain, at the National Gallery of Art. The BBC made the Tish Murtha documentary. There were all exhibitions of format photography as well. So the first women's photographic agency. So this kind of, I guess I was interested in how then the three of you might see this interest, this kind of renewed interest and attention in photography from this moment now at this time.
I mean, we do a lot of educational work out of SIDE. That's one of the kind of the key arms of how we engage with community, which means that we are taking images from this time period and often putting them in front of 10-year-olds. And that kind of, they are growing up with photography. Their primary way of understanding the world through their mum's phone most of the time is photography. So the way that they are engaging with these images and the way that they are understanding access to people's lives, I think is part of the reason why these kind of early projects that really are looking at the human condition, like what it is to be a person, no matter what circumstance you're looking at it in. It isn't, it's not poverty porn. This is what it is to be a person at this point in time in this location. And actually, when you're putting that in front of children and teenagers, they are responding and understanding their own lives through it. And I think we're looking at stuff that is becoming ever more prescient today as we are going through our own kind of austerity and cost of living crisis. Kids whose mum have to go to the food bank look at these images and understand that generation. They understand those people. And I think that's part of why it kind of is coming back into culture. It's that these lives are not different from our lives. and people really want to kind of feel seen and feel understood. And these types of projects do help them with that.
Carla, Paul, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you know, again, this might be a rather sort of wide sweeping statement, but it seems like, you know, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the 70s, certainly through Camera Work magazine, there seems to have been this rediscovery of the 1930s. And the 1930s was seen as this amazing radical moment in the beginning of British documentary, both in film and in photography, and organisations like Mass Observation, the photographs that eventually became part of Picture Post during the war. Obviously not, I mean, I'm just trying to think of, obviously, people like Bert Hardy, who you've mentioned. It was not the same as what was going on in the 1970s, but it was a kind of earlier moment where ordinary people were being documented for the first time. And there were also discoveries around sort of people like Edith Tudor Hart, who was part of something called the Film and Photo League, which is a very little known radical workers group. There were far more impressive groups like that in the States and France and Germany. So there was this, there are many articles in Camera Work magazine which refer back or which are about a rediscovery of the 30s. And I think what's happening today, or part of what's happening today, is it seems like there's been a rediscovery of the 70s in a not dissimilar way. I mean, certainly, I've been at Four Corners far too long, and, you know, like 15, 20 years ago, documentary was almost a dirty word. You know, no one was interested in documentary. It was all sort of formal stuff or conceptual stuff. I mean, I was, but I was, you know, I was a kind of an anomaly, really. And it's really come back as something that people are, you know, are passionate about, as you say, that where they sort of can see their lives in it, or that, you know, they can see meaning in it, and they're interested in reinventing it, and that's very, very interesting. And the fact that you know, people in their 20s are so fascinated by images that were taken in the 70s or 80s, and it'd be really interesting to hear from anyone here who has got any thoughts on that, because it seems to be something that has happened over the last 10, 15 years, maybe.
Paul, did you
Well, I
want
mean, you know, we started this magazine called Camera Work. We were just a small group, unpaid, and we would meet once a week. And we'd say, okay, well, what have we got, you know? And so people had particular interests, like, for example, Ed Barber was really interested in portraiture, said, okay, you go ahead and, you know, get something together on that. That we had somebody interested in alternative technology. Basically, you've created this vehicle. It's got to go from A to B, and then from B to, and so on. But it's available. You've created this vehicle. So, as you just mentioned, the looking back at projects from the 30s was just something that came up. One evening, somebody said, yeah, have you seen this? This is some pictures from the 30s. Oh, yeah, there was the Photo League, something or other. And then Tom Picton, who was one of our group, was also a lecturer. And he came over with a book called Worktown. And there were only about 300 copies of Worktown ever printed at the Royal College of Art. They printed this book of photographs made in the 30s. And this was the mass observation project. So suddenly, what's all this about? A mass observation were basically artists, poets, writers, photographers, painters, who were kind of, upper class, middle class and upper class, elite kind of people of that time, of the 30s, who were interested basically almost in an anthropological way of investigating this strange country called the North of England, you know? And they would go over there and they would just sort of do what they, like what was the famous guy? There was one photographer whose name I've forgotten. He was this brother of a poet, a well-known poet.
Humphrey Spender.
Humphrey Spender.
Yeah.
Humphrey, yeah. So he would go into a pub, thanks, and sneak, take pictures, almost sneaky. But the fact is, this work, the fact we discovered this work actually existed, and it was black and white, and we could kind of trace a sort of tradition, a bit of history. It's always nice to, I suppose, if you're a football enthusiast, you might want to know the very early, cup finals in 1892. It's great to have that sense of traction and tradition. And so we were doing that. So we were, and in my group, the exit photography group, because it took so long, by the end we were experts in our subject. So we discovered the Farm Security Administration photographs, great American documentary, again created by the government in a time of crisis. They call it crisis. The cost of living crisis is just a severe crisis of inequality. They should rename it the severe crisis of inequality. The media have decided to call it the cost of living crisis. No, it's not. It's the fact that the society is so unequal, some people have just literally have flipped and can't actually manage anymore. That's how severe this inequality is at the moment. And it should be named that, actually. And, if I was in a position to put, that's what I would do, But the people who actually do write all this stuff and control all this message and so on are still more or less the same people, and they're very powerful. We had an opportunity in this book, as ordinary people living in inner cities, to spell out what we saw. And I've got to say, at the end, because it's in 4 parts, the picture story is in 4 parts. The first part is called Growth. And there's lots of kids growing up. It's also about when the economy is growing, growth, remember that, wow, growth, everything's fine. So the first part's called Growth. The next part is Promise. And Promise is about the contract we all have with society, or society has a contract with us, the promise. So there's certain expectations we all have. The next one was called Welfare, and it actually showed the people who basically are not, the welfare system is not managing to support as part of the contract. So that part, and the last part is called Reaction, and it covers all kinds of reactions, religious, political, violence, whatever response people have to that. We were in a position to put this down from our by the way, so this is the bit I wanted to mention, the bit about Reaction. Don't forget, we did this in 1979, we finished it. In Reaction, we show looting, and we show violence, and we show all kinds of stuff. And people said, hey, this scenario is wrong because we don't have riots in Britain. We don't have this. This was just, we made it up, we created this scenario from our photographs. But before it was published, in 1981, the riots happened. So it looked like we were just reporting on events. Well, actually, we were reporting on what we understood because we'd been doing this for 6 years, and we were very close to what was going on, and we felt completely confident in our vision, in our understanding, in the communication, and that's why it exists like that, and that's why it ends. The last picture, I believe, is this picture of a terrorist. Now, the image, it's a kind of a warning, and the text there is a kind of not related to it. It's actually a guy. It's a guy working in a West Indian concerned self-help group. in London somewhere, and he's just talking and the chapter. So all those chapters, by the way, this is interesting. The first words, all these are, each chapter has a generic title. We just pulled it out from what people said, the first words. And in the interview, he says, if only they knew, kind of a warning. So in a way, in a shorthand, like this, the hard road, somebody said that. Take them as they are. Yeah. If you can't do the crime, don't do, or can't do the time, don't do the crime. Nobody looking after them. So in a way, you could just read the titles of the chapters and the interviews, and it kind of tells you the whole story of the narrative of this book. And the point I'm trying to make is that we had control to be able to do that. And in that time, that was extremely rare. You know, photographers just handed in the work, somebody else would do the layout, somebody else would decide, no, you can't say that, or boom. And luckily, we're living now with social media, you know, it's just opened, and that's, I think, fantastic. We can hear everything from the absolute, you know, well, I mean, yeah, the complete trash to everything else. But I mean, I prefer that, and to understand what's there and to see, you know, all that sick stuff that's out there. It's important to know it. It's important to know. It's like a virus. We need to know about these viruses to protect ourselves.
So maybe just continuing on from that and thinking a little bit about the contemporary moment. I'm aware of time, and I want to make sure that we open it up to the audience. But maybe if I could just ask as a final question about, because of course there are lots of individual photographers, collectives who are still working in this mode, and you know, particularly Ellen and Carla, the work that you do with those artists, but also in your programming. And I wondered if you might say a little bit about what the particular concerns, challenges, debates, problems, whether that's formal, whether that's sociological, what are the artists and yourselves with your institutions and your organizations and your programming, what are you wrestling with now that is similar perhaps to that 70s moment, to what we see in survival programs, and what's different?
We're really looking at the fact that there is a technology divide. Everyone has a phone now doesn't actually mean the same thing. Not everyone has access to the same equipment. During lockdown, it was evident some kids could not go to school online because they did not have access to a laptop. They did not have access to the internet. There is this divide that happens, and how we can create a situation where people can narrate their own stories, who can bring and create their own art in a situation where their access to producing these things is actually hindered by the kind of the social structure that we live in, the cost of living crisis, the fact that they aren't able to access this type of thing. It's how we can bring community and we can allow people to tell stories, because people's rights to tell their own story is something that's very important now. I think we've reached a point in time where a lot of people, you see it a lot in cinema, why would a straight white man be able to make a film about a gay black man, for example? It's that idea that people should be able to represent themselves, but actually we're not in a place yet where everyone can. And that is one of those big conversations that we're trying to figure out and deal with, because we call ourselves guardians of memory, which sounds quite ridiculous, but really what it means is we believe that everyone has a story that matters. And if it can be captured and it can be looked after, we want to look after it. No matter who you are, your life has meaning and it has purpose. And if it is being documented in some way, then we will look after that document for you. But how does it get documented? And that is kind of the situation we're in, particularly when funding is not there, the access to spaces is not there that it used to be. Community projects are not getting the backing they used to. But how do we stop it so people who will be the most affected by this, how do we make it so they can actually access it?
Thank you. And I think funding is a really interesting story. And, you know, I won't ask the question because I know maybe someone in the audience can usefully ask the question. But
Yeah.
Carla, what
No,
are your
I mean, I would really echo a lot of what Ellen's just said. And I think particularly, I mean, some of the projects we've been doing recently have raised a lot of questions in terms of issues around authorial voice, you know, the ownership of people's own, you know, told histories. Obviously, I think our emphasis over the last few years has been very much around sort of supporting or trying to reveal hidden histories, untold histories. I mean, this, I just wanted to show you this one, Brick Lane 78, was a particularly interesting project, I think, that raised a lot of challenges for us as an institution about how we go about a project that is to do with people's histories. So this is actually full of these, this was all based on, in fact, Paul's work that he did again in the 1970s with the local Bengali community, particularly around the Brick Lane area of East London, at a time when there was huge racism and a big anti-fascist, anti-racist movement, and really the first time that the local Bengali population became, most of whom were first generation or sort of just second generation, became galvanized to stand up and protest. And these are amazing images. And really what the program was the project had a number of strands. It ended up in an exhibition, but a lot of it was trying to trace the people, the original people in the images, to do oral histories with them, and to really represent that history today to, in fact, their children and grandchildren, which was a very inspiring and moving project to do. But it also did raise a lot of issues in terms of how we worked with those communities as an organisation which is still predominantly white, middle class, you know, seen as being an art organisation, how we could get beyond that. We worked with a lot of participants and volunteers, and so that was certainly one way of doing it. But you know, that I suppose I'm just really echoing what you're saying. I think that as an art organisation now, thinking about if you want to have a genuine kind of transformative impact and work on kinds of engagement with imagery, you have to actually ask yourself quite challenging questions about who you are, who you exist for, the ways in which the work you produce is made, and also how it's exhibited. So lots of those kind of questions, I think, are very important.
Yeah, thank you. Well, maybe now's a good time to hand over to Layli to